July 28, 1540, Hampton Court Palace. 50-year-old Henry VIII marries his fifth wife. Catherine Howard is just 19 years old, young enough to be his daughter, beautiful, vivacious, and fatally naive about the man she has. Just pledged to love, honor, and obey until death. Henry calls her his rose without a thorn. He believes Catherine represents a fresh start, a chance to recapture the passion and joy that marriage once brought him. For the first time in years, the aging king feels young again. He showers Catherine with gifts, writes her love letters, and parades her before the court like a trophy. But Catherine Howard carries secrets that will destroy her, a past filled with indiscretions that she thought were safely buried, and a present filled with temptations that she lacks the wisdom to resist. In Henry's England, queens who have secrets don't tend to keep their heads very long. This is the story of how youth, beauty, and poor judgment can prove fatal when your husband is the most dangerous man in Europe. Subscribe now, because we're about to witness the fastest fall from grace in royal history. Catherine Howard was born into one of England's most powerful noble families, but her personal circumstances were far from ideal. Her father was a younger son with limited means. Her mother died when Catherine was young. She was sent to live with her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, in a household that was supposed to provide her with proper education and supervision. Instead, Catherine grew up in an environment of shocking negligence and moral laxity. The Dowager Duchess was elderly and rarely supervised the young people in her care. Catherine shared dormitory-style sleeping quarters with other girls and young men of the household, with minimal adult oversight and virtually no privacy. This arrangement led to inevitable romantic entanglements. Catherine was an attractive, affectionate girl who craved attention and approval. At just 13 years old, she began a sexual relationship with her music teacher, a man named Henry Mannix. The relationship was inappropriate on multiple levels. Mannix was an adult in a position of authority over a child, and the age difference alone made the relationship abusive by any reasonable standard. When the relationship with Mannix ended, Catherine quickly became involved with Francis Dereham, a gentleman of the household who was closer to her own age. This relationship was more serious and lasted longer. Dereham and Catherine exchanged gifts, called each other husband and wife in private, and behaved like a married couple. In the informal legal understanding of the time, they may have been considered married by common law. The relationship with Dereham continued until Catherine was about 17, when her family arranged for her to come to court as a lady-in-waiting. To Anne of Cleves, this was intended as an opportunity for Catherine to make a prestigious marriage, but it would ultimately prove to be her doom. Catherine's arrival at court in 1539 immediately attracted attention. She was young, beautiful, and possessed of the kind of vivacious charm that Henry found irresistible in women. More importantly, she was English, from a prominent Catholic family, and everything that Anne of Cleves was not. Henry's marriage too. Anne of Cleves was already failing when Catherine arrived at court. The king was looking for distraction from his matrimonial disappointment, and Catherine provided exactly the kind of youthful energy and flirtation that appealed to his aging ego. Catherine, for her part, was dazzled by the king's attention. She had grown up in relative poverty and obscurity. Suddenly she found herself the object of desire for the most powerful man in England. Henry showered her with gifts, jewelry, and attention that no previous suitor had been able to match. The relationship developed quickly. During the spring and early summer of 1540, Henry was 50 years old, massively overweight, and suffering from painful leg ulcers that made him increasingly difficult to be around. But he was also the king, and Catherine was ambitious enough to see past his physical deterioration to the power and wealth he represented. Henry's pursuit of Catherine was complicated by his need to end his marriage to Anne of Cleves first. But once the annulment was secured in July 1540, Henry wasted no time in making Catherine his fifth queen. The wedding ceremony was small and private, reflecting both Henry's desire for a quick remarriage and his awareness that another royal wedding might seem excessive to his subjects. Catherine's coronation as queen was magnificent. designed to showcase Henry's joy in his new wife and to demonstrate that the king had recovered from the embarrassment of the Inn of Cleves. Disaster. Catherine wore cloth of gold and jewels worth a fortune. Henry himself seemed rejuvenated by his young bride, appearing happier and more energetic than he had in years. But Catherine was completely unprepared for the realities of being Henry's queen. She had received no education in statecraft, diplomacy, or even basic literacy. She could barely write her own name. Her understanding of court politics was minimal. Most dangerously, she had no comprehension of how precarious her position actually was. Henry expected his queens to be paragons of virtue, despite his own moral flexibility. Catherine's past relationships, which might have been overlooked in a less prominent marriage, were potential death sentences if they ever came to light, and Catherine compounded the danger by failing to understand that her behavior as queen was under constant scrutiny. The early months of Catherine's marriage seemed successful. Henry was clearly infatuated with his young wife. He gave her expensive gifts, took her on progresses around the country, and displayed her prominently at court functions. Catherine enjoyed the attention and luxury, but she failed to grasp the conditional nature of Henry's affection. Catherine's fatal mistake was not learning from the experiences of Henry's previous wives. She had witnessed Anne Boleyn's execution and Anne of Cleves' near disaster, but she seemed to believe that her youth and beauty would protect her from similar fates. She underestimated both Henry's capacity for cruelty and his obsession with his wife's moral purity. The first signs of trouble came when figures from Catherine's past began appearing at court, drawn by her new prominence and hoping to benefit from their former relationships. With the Queen, Francis Dereham, Catherine's former lover, managed to secure a position in her household. This was a catastrophically poor decision that put Catherine in daily contact with someone who knew her most dangerous secrets. Even worse, Catherine began a new romantic entanglement with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of Henry's privy chamber. Culpeper was young, handsome, and represented everything that Henry no longer was. The relationship was probably not physically consummated, but in Henry's England, the intention to commit adultery was just as treasonous as the act itself. Catherine's meetings with Culpeper were facilitated by Jane Boleyn, the widow of George Boleyn and sister-in-law to the executed Anne Boleyn. Jane should have known better than anyone how dangerous it was to facilitate a queen's indiscretions, but she seemed to enjoy the intrigue and the sense of importance it gave her. The meetings between Catherine and Culpeper took place in secret, often late at night and in private chambers. They exchanged letters and gifts. Catherine signed at least one letter to Culpeper as yours as long as life endures, language that was unmistakably romantic and potentially treasonous. Catherine's downfall began in the autumn of 1541 when one of her former servants, Mary Lascelles, decided to inform the authorities about the Queen's past relationships. Mary's brother John was a reformist who saw an opportunity to damage the Catholic Howard family by exposing Catherine's indiscretions. The information was brought to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who faced an agonizing decision. Reporting the allegations against Catherine could result in her execution, but concealing them would be treason if they were later discovered. Cranmer chose to inform Henry, probably hoping that the king would find a way to handle the situation quietly. Henry's reaction to the allegations was immediate and devastating. The man who had been so infatuated with his young wife just months earlier now felt personally betrayed and publicly humiliated. If the allegations were true, Catherine had deceived him about her virginity, bringing dishonor to their marriage and casting doubt on any children they might have. November 1541. Catherine was placed under house arrest while investigations began into her past relationships and current behavior. The questioning was thorough and brutal. Former servants, household members, and anyone who might have knowledge of Catherine's conduct were interrogated under threat of torture. The evidence that emerged painted a picture of a young woman who had been sexually active from an early age and who had continued romantic entanglements even after becoming queen. While much of Catherine's behavior might be understandable for someone her age in different circumstances, In the context of royal marriage, it constituted treason punishable by death. Catherine's initial response to the allegations was to deny everything. She claimed that her relationships with Maddox and Dereham had been innocent. She insisted that her meetings with Culpeper were purely platonic. But the evidence was overwhelming, and her denials were clearly false. As the investigation continued, Catherine's composure began to crack. She was just 20 years old, facing the possibility of execution and receiving no support from her family or former friends. The Howard family, led by her uncle the Duke of Norfolk, distanced themselves from Catherine to protect their own positions. December 1541. Parliament was called to consider Catherine's case. The evidence of her premarital relationships and her suspicious behavior with Thomas Culpeper was presented in detail. The conclusion was foregone. Catherine had committed treason through her deceptions and adulterous intentions. Catherine's response to her condemnation revealed both her youth and her desperation. She wrote pleading letters to Henry, begging for mercy and claiming that she had been led astray by others. She promised to enter a convent and spend the rest of her life in penance if only Henry would spare her life. But Henry was beyond mercy. He felt that Catherine had made him look foolish before his subjects and foreign observers. His pride was wounded, and his paranoia was triggered. In his mind, Catherine's betrayal was not just personal but political, undermining his authority and dignity as king. February 13, 1542. Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. She was just 21 years old. Her final speech on the scaffold was brief and dignified. She admitted her guilt, asked for forgiveness, and prayed for the king's welfare. Then she knelt and placed her head on the block. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were also executed for their relationships with Catherine. Jane Boleyn, who had facilitated Catherine's meetings with Culpeper, was declared insane but executed. Anyway, Henry had decided that mental illness was no excuse for treason. Catherine's execution marked a new low point in Henry's treatment of his wives. With Catherine, he had married someone young enough to be his daughter, failed to provide her with proper guidance or education, and then executed her for behaving in ways that were arguably predictable given her age and circumstances. The Howard family, which had hoped to benefit from Catherine's marriage to the king, was devastated by her fall. The Duke of Norfolk barely escaped execution himself and spent the rest of Henry's reign in political exile. The family's influence at court was permanently damaged. Henry's reaction to Catherine's execution was characteristically self-centered. He portrayed himself as the victim of deception and betrayal, showing no acknowledgement of his own role in the tragedy. He had married a teenager with a questionable past, provided her with no guidance about royal expectations, and then killed her when she failed to meet impossible standards. The speed of Catherine's fall from grace was unprecedented even by Henry's standards. She had been queen for less than 2 years. Her entire adult life had lasted barely longer than in Boleyn's reign. She had gone from obscurity to the throne to the scaffold, faster than seemed humanly possible. Catherine Howard's story reveals the particular vulnerabilities faced by young women in Henry's court. Her youth, lack of education, and family circumstances had left her unprepared for the dangers of royal marriage. Her tragic end demonstrated that in Henry's England, ignorance was no defense against treason charges. Henry was now 51 years old and had executed 2 wives in 6 years. His reputation for matrimonial violence was spreading across Europe, making it increasingly difficult to find suitable candidates for future marriages. Foreign princesses were beginning to decline English marriage proposals, reportedly saying they preferred to keep their heads attached to their bodies. But Henry's appetite for marriage remained undiminished. He had learned nothing from Catherine's tragedy except that he needed to be more careful about investigating his future wives' backgrounds. The man who had destroyed 5 marriages remained convinced that the right woman could still bring him happiness. Next time, we'll meet Catherine Parr, the woman brave enough or desperate enough to become Henry's 6th and final wife. She will discover that surviving marriage to Henry VIII requires not just intelligence and diplomacy, but also the ability to navigate the increasingly paranoid and violent mind of a king who has learned to see treason in every shadow.